Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to those here live and online. Online, by the way, I should have said last time, please do feel free to ask questions, whether via the chat function or by voice, and I'll try and repeat what you ask. And I'll also try and repeat what people live ask, because of people who online told me they couldn't hear the live questions. So we were looking at the influence of culture, history, society, science at the time on the Torah SheBichtav, on the written Torah. And I'm not going to repeat the introduction from last time, other than to mention that, as we discussed last time, this is an exceptionally sensitive topic, much more sensitive than looking at the effect on Chazal. It's sensitive on a number of levels. Firstly, because we know much less about society at the time, 3,500+ years ago, than we do about the times of Chazal. And therefore, it's by definition more speculative. And as soon as you start speculating, you risk, obviously, inaccuracy. And secondly, because we're talking about an author with a capital A, who is above time and space, and giving a Torah, which in our understanding, as per the Rambam in the Ikrim, has an eternity associated with it. So we'll have to look at the parameters of that eternity. Does that mean that the Torah is above time and space to the degree that the form it takes is uninfluenced by the times? Not necessarily, but certainly it has a nitzchias associated with it, an eternity, eternal values connected to it. So on the one hand, this sounds like a very controversial topic. On the other hand, in a sense, we're familiar with the idea. None of us have a problem that the laws of Nezikin are presented with Shorosh and Ogach Sapara, a cow that calls an ox that calls a cow. And all of us understand, we've been to numerous shurim in which we see how the most sophisticated technological questions or modern day life, medical ethics can be dealt with by halacha, even though the halachic system frames it in terms of the situation at the time. So in that sense, the fact that the examples used by the Torah are connected to a particular locality, that's not controversial, that's not problematic in the least. Similarly, the Torah had been given in mid-America, to the Aztecs. Perhaps it's spoken about a llama that bites, I don't know what animals they have there. It would have dealt with different creatures. None of us would have had a problem with that. So the stories of the Torah that teach eternal values, the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim or Korach or the Meraglim, have a degree of contingency to them. They're circumstantial. And again, none of us have a problem with that. So clearly, there are extremes to be found here. There are forms of statements around these things which would be deeply problematic within our Masorah, and others which are perfectly in order. So there's a question to explore, but nonetheless one that needs to be handled with a lot of sensitivity. So what can we say about this question? So I touched upon this last time, and I think the most classic Maramokim, the most classic source around this topic to start the issue is around that of the Carbonus, the sacrifices. Because here we have a machlokas, an argument between the Rambam and the Ramban. And like so much else around these topics, the Rambam really starts the conversation in his Moran of Achim. He deals with this in the third section of his Moran, the third section of the Guide to the Perplexed, and really deals with it in many chapters. Chelek Gimel, the third section, chapter 32, all the way through to chapter 46 and other such places where he addresses this topic. And he's specifically dealing with the issue of Carbonus. We've discussed on previous occasions the theology of the Rambam, in which the Rambam has a focus on the intellect and the mind and the philosophical understanding of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and sees that as the highest level of worship. And this needs further fleshing out, which we've done on other occasions, because of course the Rambam also speaks about midot, character traits. He speaks about actions. The Rambam wrote the Mishnah Torah, the complex halachic system. But he sees them as on some level feeding ultimately into how we think, into how we view the world. And Carbonus are difficult for the Rambam. We discussed, I mentioned last week, that Carbonus are not a trivial part of the Torah. They are there right at the center of the Torah, the whole of Sefer Vayikra. In the structure of the Torah, they're given a centrality. In the quantity of halachas and written text about them, it's the whole of Sefer Vayikra. It's a considerable part of Shemos, the building of the Mishkan. a considerable part of Bamidbar, the traveling with the Mishkan. These aren't a considerable part of the Zvorim. It speaks about the Beis HaMikdash, the permanent temple. So it's not a trivial part of the Torah. And yet, this is a very raw, physical way of serving Hashem. So the Rambam in his Moreh Nevuchim discusses this. And he says the explanation is that at the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, when they left Egypt, Klal Yisrael knew and lived in an environment in which the worship of Hashem, of gods, the most well-known means of serving the divine, of reaching beyond oneself as a human being, and the general method to which human beings were raised to serve that which is beyond, in this context paganism, was through sacrifices, was through Carbonus. And therefore, when Hashem taught the Jewish people the way of serving them, he didn't command us to abandon this manner of service and discard it and cancel it, now nullify it completely, because he says that would be impossible for us humans at the time to have accepted. Rather, he channeled it and says, take this way of pagan service and use that as a way of serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he says that the Torah was careful when it taught us to serve Hashem in this way, to remove any aspects of the service that could be associated with Avodah Zarah, with pagan practice. So it tweaked it and channeled it, but ultimately it was adapting a method of avodah, of service, of paganism, of Avodah Zarah, and adapting that to Avodas Hashem. So an example he gives of how it's adapted are the animals that are chosen for the service of Hashem. So which animals are chosen? Those which were not used as sacrifices by the pagans around, those which were actually worshipped or seen as spiritual by the society around. So what are the sacrifices that are used? The lamb, the sheep. And sheep, of course, the lamb is the most familiar holy animal for the Egyptians. This is the Egyptian idolatry. Therefore, the sheep or the lamb has a centrality in Carbonus. Similarly, the goat. In fact, in our last series, 2 series back, we looked at demonology, shading in the Torah. We saw the Torah uses the word goat for demonology. Shading were believed to take the form of goats, and therefore again these are sacrificed in the Beis HaMikdash. And finally, the other most common carbon is the cow, the parah, which we know to this day in significant parts of the East, India in particular, has a sanctity. By the way, was aware of it by the time of the Rambam. There was a lot of cross correspondence with the Indians. The Greeks had conquered all the way to India. The Rambam mentions the Indians specifically. They worship the cow, and therefore this is the other carbon that is used, the other sacrifice that is used. So this is the thesis of the Rambam. Now this raises a lot of questions. What are we to make of the idea that such a central part of the Torah is used as a means to adapt pagan worship? And why on earth should Hashem wish to do so? I mean, to the point of the Torah is to rid of paganism. Why would it do it in this manner? Also, it raises questions about where are we heading? What will the future bring? A large part of our tefillah is about the restoration of Carbonus. Is that indeed the plan? Is that where we should aspire to? Is that what we want? Is that where it's heading? Given the issue that Carbonus seems to be somewhat of an ad hoc solution to a problem. Does this tie into the discomfort that maybe we struggle with a little bit when we learn about the Carbonus? It's actually very difficult to relate to. According to the Rambam, maybe it's not surprising that it's difficult to relate to, because after all, we live in a post-pagan world in which no one is really worshipping gods or the gods with sacrifice at all. So where do we go with all of this? And then there are harder questions, but more technical questions, which are asked by the Rishonim. We find figures even pre-Matan Torah using sacrifice to serve Hashem. Right at the dawn of humanity, Cain and Hevel, right? They have their dispute. It ends up in a murder. I'm not going to go into the whole story now, but we read it just a couple of weeks ago. What did they do? They brought sacrifices, Carbonus. One of them brought a vegetarian sacrifice to Hashem, plant life, the other one brought animal life, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There seems to be value in Carbonus that was perceived by the very first human beings who knew Hashem directly and certainly hadn't confronted paganism. The Rambam himself addresses many of these, though not all these questions, And the basic thesis, the Rambam says, and I touched on this last time and I've touched on it in the past, is one that deserves to be spelt out, is that it is true that Hashem is all-powerful. Hashem is above time and space, and therefore certainly wouldn't be caught up in contingency of time and space. And certainly, in essence, the divine truth, the divine law should be above time and space. Nonetheless, he's giving it to us human beings. We human beings live in time and space. We human beings are very much creatures of our society, of history, of science at the time. We are affected by the culture within which we are embedded, within which we live. And therefore, when the infinite, absolute, who is indeed above time and space, encounters us, physical human beings, who very much live within time and space, of course we are affected by it. Of course, we need to hear the words of Hashem as is appropriate for us at the time. And therefore, the Torah, which takes the absolute truth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's communicated to us in a way that is appropriate to us at the time. We are limited, not HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, dealing with limited beings, therefore obviously needs to give a Torah that is appropriate to that. Is Hashem not all able? Couldn't he rise above our limitations? Well, the answer is yes and no, and this is something we discussed previously. Within the context of creation, there are logical paradoxes that are meaningless, which would introduce a destruction of creation. HaKadosh Baruch Hu can't, in the words of Sadigan, create a square triangle, not because he isn't all able, but because a square triangle is a nonsensical context in the context and meanings of words that we imbue. These are concepts that we humans use, and therefore for us this is a contradiction in terms, doesn't make sense. Since HaKadosh Baruch Hu values free will, the last thing he would do would be to remove human free will. He can't have free human beings whom he is controlling and puppeteering. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not going to give us a Torah which expects us to instantly move from 0 to 60. All physical, material objects take time to move, to change, to adapt. There's natural inertia. However fast we move, however much we change, however efficient your car is, it's always going to take some number of seconds. Similarly, human beings can't adapt instantly. Baruch can do anything. That's a flick of the metaphorical hand. He could change us, but that counters the very purpose of creation, or a purpose of creation, which is for us to be free-willed beings, not to be robots, not to be puppets. Were he to change us such that we could accept a Torah which reflects the truth in the fullest extent possible for us human beings to conceive, it would contradict our being. Therefore, we need time to adjust. Therefore, the appropriate way for us to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu is to a time that's a manner which speaks and is appropriate to us at the time. So says the Rambam in his Guide to the Perplexed, in his Moreh Nevuchim. He then sort of almost midrashically interprets this into a pasuk. It's a pshat in the pasuk, but it gives a sort of broader sense to the pasuk. And this is the pasuk that says that we had to move through the Midbar to the land of Israel when we left Egypt. Hashem didn't lead us through the land of the Philistines, the Pelishtim, because it was near Peniren and Milchama, V'shavim Mitzrayma, lest we see war and return to Egypt. In other words, the path through which we had to arrive to the land of Israel was a slow path. It wasn't the most efficient route. Why was it not the most efficient route? Surely Hashem should act in the most efficient manner. The answer is he can do so, but we couldn't. We couldn't handle it. We couldn't go straight to the land of Israel because we would have encountered war and it would have thrown us back to Egypt. So we went on a slow route through the desert. We didn't go the most theoretically quick route because we, the humans, couldn't handle it, the recipients couldn't handle it. So as the Rambam, this is in a sense a metaphor for the whole of the Torah. The Torah should be viewed as a slow route through the desert because we humans can't handle the express, direct route. And therefore, similarly, the Torah is part of the Carbonus is part of this slow pattern of edging and nudging us forward in our spiritual journey. We couldn't get there instantly without interfering with human free will. Baruch Hu sets up a framework which hopefully over time will lead us to ever greater relationship to him, ever greater sophistication. Eventually, over time, we were meant to arrive there, but he can't do more than that. He can't set up a system which will instantly get us there, because that would be direct controlling of ourselves. All he can do is provide a framework which hopefully gives us the opportunity, nudges us towards ever better decisions. So this is the Rambam, yes.
So the Rambam says it's a process,
Yeah.
a journey, and it started, when the laws given, and we had the first vessel production.
Yes.
The break, the second vessel production, and now we've got a very long break. The Rambam was flipping through there.
Yes.
We still on this journey, like how long does it take?
Okay.
Hundreds of years, we come on and we reach some kind of better state we haven't, and then drop the whole thing, wait, kind of thing, how long we have to wait, and bring back something which is supposed to be something that's good for us.
Okay. So to those online, Neil was just asking, how long is this journey meant to take? And we had the first base of Mikdash, we had the second base of Mikdash. We're now in the middle of a very extended period of Carbonus. Rambam himself lived right in the middle of that period of exile. Is our aspiration then to get back to Carbonus? Have we moved on from them? Maybe, where does this journey go? So this is an important point. I also want to mention at this point that the Rambam's idea is, all of these ideas are playing with fire, and I said this in the introduction, but I want to stress this again. This opens the can of worms, because which part of the Torah then should we look at and say this represents absolute value? Which part of the Torah should we say, well, this is contingent and part of the journey and so on and so forth? I'm not going to address this completely in this setting. We did speak about it a bit when we spoke about morality and changing morality. All I would mention here is that I think there's a useful comparison, again, to other classical areas of Torah which are not controversial. We all accept that the form through which nezikin, damages, are expressed, reflects things at the time, but we also recognize that it reflects eternal principles of justice and law, and every legal system works out like that, right? No, the English common law system, it's also a very old system, obviously, only a fraction of the age of the Torah, but nonetheless it expressed common law in terms of perhaps medieval circumstances, and we adapt that copes perfectly well with modernity also. So in that sense, of course, the Torah is eternal. In terms of the values and concepts behind it, the means of avodas Hashem, the Rambam here is arguing, reflect contingent practice. So that I think is important to spell out before I directly address Neil's question about where are we heading with all of this and how long does the journey last. The second point to mention is that the Rambam here is not arguing for a change to the halachic system. Anything which is a mitzvah, and anything which is an avera, a sin, remains a sin. The Rambam here is talking about how we understand the values behind the mitzvahs and where they are going. Nonetheless, Neil's question is an important one, which is, where is this all heading? How are we going to understand this in the future? In addition, how do we understand in the past? What were Cain and Hevel doing, bringing sacrifices? So here I want to briefly mention the alternative view to the Rambam, and I'm going to argue that it is possible the Rambam is less radical than we initially think he is in this context, and agrees more with those who argue with him than we might realize, and it's possible not. It's possible that he's very radical, and here we enter into the realm of really speculation, because the Rambam doesn't fully flesh out where he takes this. The question here basically is that the Rambam does seem to indicate that to some degree the Carbonus are a temporary solution. In the third section of Monavuchim in chapter Lamed Beis 32, he almost spelled this out. He says the prophets, the Nevi'im, stress that sacrifices are not a goal into themselves. Hashem doesn't need them. The ultimate goal is us serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is reaching HaKadosh Baruch Hu and connected to him, and we should realize that these only exist because of our need to reach and strive towards Hashem. So the Ramban attacks the Rambam very vigorously, and this is one of the reasons why this Rambam in the Monavuchim is known so well. Monavuchim, the Guide to Perplexity, has not learned that much. Ramban and Torah has learned a lot, and many pieces in the Ramban, in the Monavuchim are known because the Ramban attacks them. And the Ramban says this is not tenable. This is too central a part of the Torah. This is too significant. In addition, we find people serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu sacrifices long before the giving of the Torah. And he says, Chas v'shalom, God forbid, that one should see the sacrifices as only a negation of idolatry for the fools. Rather, we shall understand they contain within themselves a fundamental purpose, an intrinsic purpose. And he says this both on a sort of psychological level and a mystical level. I'm going to speak about the psychological level, but there's a mystical parallel in all of this. He says we human beings are raw physical beings. We're very earthy. We're made flesh and blood. We're moved by that we see, that we experience. When you brought the carbon to the Beis Hamikdash, it was a very visceral, raw, physical, tangible experience in which we saw a life extinguished. And if you went in reflecting upon that, it reminded one of the vulnerability of life. You saw blood being thrown on the Mizbeach. One pictured oneself in that process. It's explicit in Chazal that the sinner should really picture this should be happening to me. It was an eye-opening experience. It was a moving experience. It was a powerful physical experience. It was a visceral experience. It was someone taking animals, which certainly in an agricultural age were very precious to one. They were the source of wealth. They were valuable. And one was quite literally sacrificing oneself, handing over something which is valuable to one, which is physical, which one connects to, which one relates to. And through the process of sacrificing that, one quite literally drew near to the divine. One drew near to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. A sacrifice is a mistranslation. It's a carbon. Translation of the word carbon is lakriv, to draw near. I'm drawing near of myself. I'm a physical being. I'm giving of my physical property. And the most physical and human-like property that we have, which are animals, which I connect to, which have a life like mine. And I'm drawing near by quite literally offering that to Hashem. This is an intrinsic, fundamental method of drawing near to God. This isn't a negation of idolatry. He says this takes place in the psychological realm, in the physical realm, and also in the spiritual realm too. He also points out, by the way, and this is just, I mentioned this, but he says if you look at the name of Hashem used throughout Carbonus, the name is Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, the unknowable, ineffable name of Hashem. Hashem has many names. Elohim, for example, is the name of power. It's a name that's also borrowed by idol worshippers. Elohim Achim. Elohim means power. It can mean any form of power. Powerful judges are called Elohim. Powerfully evil people are referred to as Elohim. But Elohim, in the story of the Mabul, a powerful mountain can be called Elohim. Anything that's powerful can be referred to with his name. When we refer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu as Elohim, we mean he is the power behind all powers. He is the sole source of power, the ultimate power. Were the Carbonus, the undertone of the Rambam is, were the Carbonus merely a means of negating other power of idol worship, the worship would be Elohim, that of ascribing power back to Hashem. If the name used is Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, it means this is really touch closest, the highest level of connection we can get to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we can get to Hashem. So this is the Ramban. Now the undertone of the Ramban is that this thesis of the Rambam, of Maimonides, is somewhat linked to the Rambam's discomfort with physicality. The Rambam really sees the human as a mind, and physical is just the interface, and he's somewhat uncomfortable with the fact that we humans are physical bodies. Were we angels, just minds, just consciousnesses, we would perhaps do better. As we discussed in the Rambam, when we looked many years ago, we looked at the debate between the Rambam and his opponents as to whether angels are higher or lower than human beings. So the undertone here is that the Rambam is bothered by this form of service, Hashem, because it's somehow very physical, very raw, and that's not really the highest level humans can serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, I would like to suggest, based on this, 2 points. The first point is that our discomfort with Carbonus is perhaps somewhat connected with this. And secondly, that an argument could be made that the Rambam is not as far removed from the Ramban in this as we might think. And the first point I want to mention is we are very non-physical in the 21st century. We don't live in touch with raw nature. Many of us have jobs which are literally removed from any physical involvement, sitting behind a desk and typing on a computer. And even those that have more physical jobs, they're still very much engaged with a technology or with material, whether it's a builder or a plumber or an electrician. These are jobs which are very far removed from earth and from earthiness. We're very unearthly. In the 21st century, I suggest we are more influenced by this sort of mind-body divide of the Greeks, which the Rambam himself was a follower of, which we therefore relate to the Rambam in intellectual as the Rambam, but perhaps miss a dimension of human existence and part of what it means to be a human being. We like distracting ourselves and not noticing that which makes us uncomfortable, the raw physicality of life. This can be on a trivial level, and police moving away homeless people from middle-class suburbs and only allowing them to sleep in poor areas because middle-class people don't like seeing homeless people, it makes us uncomfortable. It could be outsourcing labor. So you need to sort of read Charles Dickens, which I thank God these Victorian age of child poverty and child labor have gone. They're not gone, they're just existing as close to home as Turkey and certainly further afield in Bangladesh and India and other such places. And we just don't, as long as it's out of sight, it's out of mind. And we also buy our meat vacuum packed in Taploach or Kosher Kingdom. We're very distracted from the raw physicality of the world. And I've mentioned this before, I'm not sure this is such a good thing. I'm not sure it's a healthy way of connecting to life. It perhaps removes from us the reminder of what really matters. We sort of think the economy can work on, all of us being bankers and lawyers and accountants. And we forget the need for the primary producers of, the farmers, coal miners and those that are smelting iron ore. We forget that ultimately we are physical beings. We're not just virtual creatures that exist on screen looking at each other through our Zoom link. And that loss of sort of interaction, of raw physical interaction, can't be replaced just by the world of ideas and words and the interface of the computer. It's not the same as being physically present. And I think this is our society has embarked on a loss of awareness of that. And I think this is part of what we lose about the Beis HaMikdash. Beis HaMikdash somehow feels primitive. It's very bloody, it's very raw, it's very physical, but we are primitive. We've forgotten the primitive part of ourselves. And so it doesn't want us to forget that primitive part of ourselves, which of course we are minds, of course we are neshamas and souls and consciousness, but we're also very physical, and we have an animalistic side to ourselves, which if we forget and just cut off, isn't dealt with, it's not addressed, it sort of remains as this lurking hidden twin that we don't acknowledge and perhaps deal with and ultimately refine and elevate in a very real sense. I've mentioned this before, but Shechita gets very raw deal in the press, it gets very bad press. And I don't know of actually explicit sources that claim Shechita is the kindest method of killing animals. And I would assume that sometime in the next few hundred years, it is perfectly feasible that a kinder method of killing animals is going to exist. What are we going to do at that point? How are we going to defend Shechita? And I believe at the moment now Shechita is certainly a exceptionally, relatively speaking, painless method of killing an animal. Evidence has seemed to suggest that currently with current technology is by far the most painless method of killing an animal. But I think the desire of the Torah that we use Shechita may get down to something more fundamental. And one of the reasons I think Shechita gets bad press, despite the fact that the scientific evidence is that it is, relatively speaking, a painless method of killing an animal, certainly more pain-free than other methods, is because it's bloody. It's much neater to the Western mind to see a nice, neat electrocution of an animal or a bolt to the brain, even though this is actually a far cruder way of killing an animal. The bolt to the brain causes bleeding also. It's just internal bleeding inside, which eventually suffocates the brain, eventually just compresses the brain, and that's how the animal dies. It's a far more painful way of killing an animal than slicing the neck of animals. That animal's brain is instantly deprived of oxygen. But it gets a raw press because when undercover agents film Shechita, you see a lot of blood. It's bloody, it looks messy, it looks horrible. And I think maybe that's part of what the Torah wants. It wants us to appreciate when we're killing an animal, we're taking a life. This is a privilege. We humans need to live up to this privilege, not something to take for granted. And certainly I know in my own experience, when I've watched Shechita, I've found it very, very disturbing. And I don't mean disturbing in the sense of morally troubling. I find that instant blowing out of life, that instant extinguishing of life. How life is just extinguished. One moment you have a live chicken, and a moment later it's gone. And it takes such a second. It's so gentle. You see the shochem doing it, and it's this gentle touch of a knife, because of course the knife is barely, no pressure is used, it's simply slog, and the second native animal is no longer there. It's a very sobering experience. And I think this is part of what the Torah wants. And this is what's meant to have taken place in the Beis HaMikdash, and in this very powerful experience that the Rambam is talking about, in which the chota, the sinner, in one example of a carbon, brings the sacrifice and is of course to reflect on life and its values. See, there's a couple of questions online which I will get to in a few moments. I'll take the second question first. Aren't we meant to minimize our dependence on physicality? Prime example, Moshe Rabbeinu spent 40 days without food. Well, this of course is the great debate between the Rambam and his opponents. The Rambam indeed does adopt this stance of minimizing physicality. The Rambam has a very strong ascetic tradition, in which he said that human beings ideally should be somewhat monastic. And the reason we disagree with the Christians who have a monastic tradition is because this is untrue to human nature. We humans are physical beings. We need to accept that, take steps to mitigate physicality, but ultimately we can't remove physicality. We can't exist like this. And therefore we need to engage with the world because it's the reality of the human condition. Almost all other thinkers in the Jewish tradition do not agree with this. They say we need to embrace the fact that we are physical beings and elevate it, use it for the purpose. We shouldn't fast, we should eat. But when we eat, we should do so in order to appreciate the gift of life. We should make a bracha beforehand. We should appreciate the energy it gives us and use that energy well. We should engage in earning a livelihood, in enjoying the beauty of nature, in social relationships, interaction with others, in family, in community. These are all central things to what it means to be a human being, but to be done so in a good manner, in a proper manner. We should elevate these engagements. The Rambam, in contrast, doesn't believe we're elevating them. He believes we are controlling them in order to allow us to focus on other things. The reason the Rambam and his opponents didn't become two faiths, didn't become two religions, is because of halacha. Because even the Rambam recognizes that Lamaisa, practically, when push comes to shove, we do need to engage with physicality because we are physical beings. And that's why the Torah has a halachic system which forces us to engage with physicality. The difference is the mindset. Is this a reluctant accommodation to weakness, or is this our very strength that we are able to elevate the physical? There are times when we step back from physicality. We have Yom Kippur, we have the Moshe Rabbeinu, but this isn't the long-term sustainable goal of what it means to be a human being. And as such, therefore, there's no ascetic tradition in Judaism that in practice believed in long-term bodily damage and so on. There are traditions that engage more in fasting than we currently do, both the Maimonidean tradition of the Beis Medrash starts by the Rambam, and the Hasidic Ashkenaz, for example. But these were very, very small trends within Judaism. They were not mass, and even they saw these as temporary, stepping back from physicality in order to then re-engage with it. The Nozi, right? No one suggests a long-term mass communal engagement in asceticism because this is counter to what it means to be a human being in our school of thinking. So this is the Ramban's understanding of Carbonus, and his counter-argument. He says this is a very central and fundamental part of Avodas Hashem. This is not an accommodation to pagan weakness, but this is not a negation of idolatry for fools in the Ramban's language. This is the essence of how we are meant to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, this leads us to the thought that perhaps therefore the Rambam, as I just explained, isn't so far from the Ramban. I don't know if the Rambam is saying that therefore this is a temporary aberration. He may accept that this is a fundamental part of human beings, that we are always drawn towards paganism. There's a part of us that's always drawn to this overly physical way of serving Hashem. There's maybe something fundamental to human nature, as indeed evidenced the fact that very early human beings, Cain and Abel, immediately drift to Carbonus. The Rambam's point may not be that therefore Carbonus will, practically speaking, cease to exist. He may recognize that there's always a human tendency to drift towards Avodah Zarah, to drift towards ascribing power to the physical in the universe, rather than that which is beyond, to seeing the way to engage with it, to engage physically, and therefore there's a constant need of sacrifices. The Rambam's point is philosophical, that we should realize this is a negation of a lower part of ourselves, rather than fundamentally an ideal. So this may simply be a reflection of the classic machlokas between the Rambam and his opponents, in which the Rambam also agrees we should engage in physicality. The Rambam says, for example, in Yemos HaMashiach, when Mashiach comes, human physical existence will not change. What does it mean that the wolf will lie down with the lamb? It means we will work out ways of getting on better. What does it mean that cakes will grow from trees? It simply means that technology will allow us to earn our livings easily. It doesn't say that we'll suddenly become angels. It will become malachim. It will stop needing physical food at all. Yemos HaMashiach says the Rambam, Ein Bein Yemos HaMashiach. There's no difference between their situation nowadays and the times of Mashiach in terms of the fact that we are physical beings. So just like other physical parts of the Torah will remain, albeit reluctantly, because we humans need to diminish our physical side, according to the Rambam, in order to spiritualize ourselves. And our challenge in life is not to get distracted and drawn after the physical, but to focus on the spiritual. Similarly, the Rambam may see there's something fundamental in Carbonus, in which they reflect a fundamental human urge to always physicalize how we reach out to the divine. And we need to remove that and diminish that physical side in order to fully serve Hashem properly. So in essence, it's possible that just like with other mitzvahs, the Rambam says these are fundamental to human nature. What's the divide ultimately between the Rambam and those who argue with it? It's not a halachic divide. It recognizes that we need to serve Hashem physically. It recognizes we need to do physical things. But simply what's the target? Is the target to accept we are physical beings, but then try and promote the instinct over that. So the physical distracts us as little as possible, or is the idea to elevate the physical as per the Kabbalists, as per the Mekabalim. The Rambam believes this is a reluctant accommodation to human frailty. The Mekabalim say this is an ideal accommodation to the reality and the gift and the challenge of being a human being. But both of them recognize this is fundamental to what a human being is. So it may well be that when the Rambam is speaking negatively about Carbonus, he's also accepting that they will always be a part of our lives. I want to make 2 points here. The first is an aside, that many people found themselves, including myself, very drawn after the Rambam and Maimonides in many respects. I think all of us have to be careful before we label ourselves as Maimonideans. It's not for nothing that the system of the Mekabalim has come to dominate Jewish thought, because particularly this idea of elevating the physical is one that very much we relate to and speaks to us. And this is why I try and learn both. I speak a lot about the Rambam because the Rambam isn't spoken about enough. And there's messages he says that really need to be heard. There's many aspects of the Rambam's thinking where there's no doubt that Klal Yisrael is Pascal like the Mekabalim. There's no doubt that the Kabbalistic system has come to dominate. And no one thinker has a monopoly on truth in Jewish thought. And obviously we need to draw inspiration from all the approaches to these matters. There's no doubt that the Rambam has a very, very strong ascetic tradition. There's also no doubt the Rambam has a very strong philosophical tradition, which leads him to a very philosophical approach to Yiddishkeit, in which anyone who isn't a very sophisticated thinker has really very little chance of meaningfully engaging with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And in both these respects, for most of Klal Yisrael, these have not been meaningful ways of interacting with spirituality. And for that reason, the Mekabalim have come to dominate in those areas of thought. But that's as it may, the Rambam in this reading agrees halacha l'maaseh, practical halacha to the Ramban. Carbonus always existed and perhaps always will exist. This is an eternal journey that we're going on because the struggle to physically, the struggle to be drawn off the physicality is something fundamental to human beings. Now, in this way of presenting it, it is true that we do not have paganism much in the world anymore, but we certainly haven't escaped the trap of physicality. If anything, we've drifted away. We are no longer drawn to ascribing theological or divinity, divine power to that which is physical, but we are certainly living in a world in which materialism has come to dominate, in which we see that which was material as all that there is. In the past, the material was seen as all that there is because it was divine. Now we see the material as all that it is because we with them, and the idea that there's nothing that's beyond. And therefore, Judaism's eternal message of no, remember, there are values, there's infinity, there's meaning, there's purpose, there's spirituality, where humans can transcend our physicality remains. And therefore, perhaps Carbonus remains as a valid means of so doing. So in this reading, the Rambam and the Ramban are just engaged in a classic debate. And the Rambam's point isn't that Carbonus is something temporary. His point is more that to reflect a negation of something rather than something positive. The Ramban attacks the Rambam and says, you're saying it's a negation of fools. The Rambam says, yes, it is a negation of fools, but we are all fools to some degree. Wake up and accept reality. We human beings have a foolish side to ourselves, and we need to acknowledge that and engage with it and address it. And it's so fundamental to human beings that the very first humans immediately drifted into this overly material way of serving Hashem. And by the way, it didn't end so well. Right? This is what happens when you don't realize how to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu properly. So this is a one reading of the Rambam, and I'll call it the less controversial way of reading the Rambam. The Rambam in Mishnah Torah, by the way, seems to say this explicitly. And I'm not going to here get into the debate about how the Mishnah Torah interacts with the Moed of Vachim, other than to say, I think there's a question here that I've missed out, other than to say that the Rambam seems to say this explicitly in his Mishnah Torah, and how that fits what he says in Moed of Vachim remains a very, very good question. And here I'm referencing the last halacha in Hilchos Me'ilah. Now, the Rambam wrote 14 books to his Mishnah Torah, which deal with different sections of halacha. He has his Sefer Mada, which deals with more philosophical service of Hashem. He has Zmanim, which deals with Yom Tovim and Shabbos, and Nezikin, which gives the damages, and so on and so forth. He has 14 sections to his Mishnah Torah. At the end of each book, he deals with, he sort of drifts into a little bit of Medrash, a little bit of Musa, a little bit of philosophy. So his concluding halacha is often sort of more conceptual and idea-based. Now, at the end of the book that deals with sacrifices and service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the final halacha of Hilchas Me'ilah, he makes the following point. He says, what is Me'ilah? Me'ilah is literally translated as trespass. Me'ilah is when you take that which is holy and use it for a secular manner. It is less majesty, it's a diminution of that which is majestic and royal. So if you steal from a mere mortal, another human being, you're a gazan or a gunner, you're a thief. If you steal from the Beis HaMikdash, you have engaged in me'ilah, in betrayal, in almost revolution, revolt against the king. So this is the concept of me'ilah. For example, taking a carbon and using it for mundane purpose, stealing from the Beis HaMikdash, taking one of the utensils of the Beis HaMikdash and using it to chop your own firewood. This is the concept of me'ilah. Says the Ramban, there is a, he brings at the beginning of the last halacha me'ilah, he says it's royal adam is spoken in the mishpatei Torah kadosha. V'leita sof in yonam kfi koiche. It's appropriate for a person to meditate on the Holy Torah and know the ultimate purpose according to his capacity. So here the Rambam is saying basically, learn monavachim, right? You need to understand the reasons for mitzvahs. It's not enough just to practice Torah. We need to understand the purpose. But then he adds a word of caution. However, he says, something where we cannot know the reason, don't let it be light in one's eyes. Don't break it. Nor should they break through it to ascend to Hashem, lest Hashem burst out against him. Meaning to say, a spiritual seeker may sometimes be tempted to destroy halacha in search of reaching Hashem. In powerful words. That's what Ramban is talking about, challenging himself faced. When you engage genuinely in spirituality, sometimes your thirst, and the Ramban, by the way, was not a cold philosopher. The Ramban was drunk with the love of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He felt a tremendous thirst to know HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to draw close to him. So the Rambam, sometimes you can be tempted when so doing to break through halachic boundaries. Don't do that. And then he uses his parable to me'ilah. He says, look how seriously the Torah takes me'ilah, in which you are using for secular purpose that which is meant to be spiritual, the sticks and stones for the Beis HaMikdash. And he says, my mates and mavanim off of Aver, dust and ashes and wood and stones, as soon as they have the name of Hashem stamped on them, they have kedusha, and anyone who uses them for secular purposes needs atonement. Kal v'chomer, much more so for the mitzvahs, which HaKadosh Baruch Hu stamped his name on, which he carved out for us. We should be careful not to mistreat them, not to kick them, not to discard them. And then he carries on and he speaks about the difference between Mishpatim and Chukim. Mishpatim and the mitzvahs we can understand, Chukim and the mitzvahs where we find it harder to understand. The Rambam doesn't believe we can't understand them. He gives extensive explanation of Chukim. It's certainly less intuitive, certainly harder to understand. In fact, Chukim are the very things where the Rambam argues that they are contingent upon society and history at the time. And that's one of the reasons we struggle to understand them, because they are the mitzvahs which are appropriate to the circumstances at the time. And he says, for all of these, even if we are unable to find the reason, don't discard them, continue to keep them. And then he says, all the Carbonus amongst the Chukim. Now, this fits perfectly with what he said in the Moed in which he explains Carbonus are not Chukim, are not mitzvahs we can't understand, but mitzvahs which are only understandable in the context of if we understand the history and society at the time. And then he says, to doing these Chukim, we achieve eternity in the world to come. And the Torah gave precedence to Chukim. So if we ask, what does the Torah give precedence to? It gives precedence to the Chukim rather than the Mishpatim. Why? Rambam doesn't exactly explain to us. So what has the Rambam said in this final chapter, Me'ilah? Number one, we need to search out for the reasons for mitzvahs. Number two, we need to be careful not to be dismissive of chukim if we don't fully understand the reasons. Number three, they are very much the route to reach Olam Haba, to reach, in the Rambam's Anglican translation of Olam Haba, some sort of merging of mind, some sort of intellectual and meditative transcendent experience in which our consciousnesses connect to the divine, because we fine-tuned and honed our consciousnesses in a very philosophical way. That's what the Rambam says. But the chukim, which deal with the more basic part of a human being, the more raw physical part of a human being, which are contingent upon human society, are as fundamental to get to Olam Haba, and in the Torah given precedence, perhaps because they are less intuitive than the Mishpatim. In other words, the Rambam, as much as he disdains the physical side of ourselves and sees it as being negated, recognizes this is a fundamental part of what we human beings are. And the only way to reach transcendence is to acknowledge that part of ourselves and deal with ourselves. So certainly there's indication in the Rambam Mishnah Torah that we need to be very cautious before we read the Moreh Nevuchim to be saying Carbonus are just circumstantial and therefore they are to be negated. It is possible and probable in the Rambam, because he explicitly says mitzvahs are never cancelled, and what he means to say this is something fundamental to how human beings adopt and adapt and live, and the societies within which live, and the permanent search for human beings to be drawn after physicality and need to avoid it. So this is the less controversial reading of Rambam, and in this reading we certainly understand our prayer for a restoration of the Beis HaMikdash and for Carbonus, and a reference to Reach Nechorach and the like. Next week in Mitzvah Hashem, we will look at an alternative reading of Rambam, which is a certainly more profound and troubling one, and so on. And we'll look how that would fit with the Rambam's thoughts around the eternity of the Torah. I'm certainly not going to take sides in this machlokas, and I'm simply going to point out that the less controversial reading I've shared now is certainly the mainstream one in Jewish thought. But we will look at alternative reading of Rambam, which is more difficult. But then I'm going to try and take these ideas and apply them to some other mitzvahs and other examples in the Torah, and we will look at slavery, which we looked at before. We will look at some of the challenges of biblical criticism, which I don't think we've ever looked at in this in our Sunday morning series, and see what the Rambam would say about those. And I hope that this will enrich our understanding of Yiddishkeit. So I'll stop here for today, and thank you so much for all of you who have joined, both on screen and live. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone, and thank you, as always, for joining.